Okay, everybody ready? Looks like it's 4 o'clock. Okay, hello and welcome everybody. My name is Susan Ryan and I'm the Chief Mission Officer here at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. I'm honored to serve as the moderator for today's webinar. We are so glad you can join us for the next hour as we discuss how ancestral Pueblo people utilized various strategies to mitigate risk, especially during times of climate change. We hope you, your families, and your communities are staying safe and healthy, and we assure you that our Crow Canyon family is thinking of you in this time of social and spatial distancing. A few matters of housekeeping, though, before we get started here. Let me advance my slide. Funding for our webinar series has been provided by Colorado Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the CARES Act Economic Stabilization Plan of 2020. There are many staff members working behind the scenes that are dedicated to the success of these programs, and I want to acknowledge Taylor Hasbrook and Dylan Schwint in particular. And next, on to some Zoom logistics. If for some reason the window that has the presenter is blocking the content on the screen that you wish to read, you can move it around by clicking on it and then dragging it to a different part of your screen. If you have questions for our presenters, I encourage you to type them into the Q&A prompt located at the bottom on the ribbon, the bottom of your screen on that ribbon, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we possibly can following the presentation. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Crow Canyon's YouTube channel. The address is located on the bottom of your screen, and you can always go back and watch any of the webinars you may have missed in the past. For those of you who are familiar with Crow Canyon, know that the work we do has a really important and unique mission. And for those of you who are not familiar with our organization, the mission of Crow Canyon is to empower present and future generations by making the past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. And it's important to acknowledge the indigenous cultures of the Four Corners region that resided on these lands in the past, who continue to live on these lands in the present, and will do so in the future. The work we do as archaeologists would not be possible without recognizing and honoring the generations of people who built these incredible civilizations that we learn from on a daily basis. And we thank you in joining us with that acknowledgement. Also, I'd like to make you aware of 2 upcoming webinars. Next Thursday, September 10th at 4 o'clock Mountain Time, we have Worlds Forever Changed, the Coronado Expedition by Matt Schmader and John Gate. And on Thursday, September 17th at 4 o'clock Mountain Time, we have Exploring Social Environments in the Southeast and Southwest by Kathy Cameron. And also on a more serious note, our Native communities have been greatly impacted by COVID-19, and I'm sharing this slide with you in order for you to look at the organizations that are dedicated to providing some relief to our friends and neighbors. And if you're interested, we can also provide you with this information following the webinar. All right, so next it is my pleasure to introduce 2 of my talented colleagues. Grant Snitker is an environmental archaeologist and paleo-fire scientist specializing in the dynamic feedbacks between fire, humans, and the long-term environmental change. His current research focuses on anthropogenic fire and social ecological systems, using comparative case studies in Spain, the US Southeast, and the Pacific Northwest. Grant earned a PhD in anthropology from Arizona State University and is currently a postdoc researcher in the Department of Crop and Social Sciences and an associate of the Center for Archaeological Sciences at the University of Georgia in Athens. Dr. Colleen Strawhacker is a program director for the Arctic Sciences section in the Office of Polar Programs at the National Science Foundation. Colleen earned her PhD in anthropology from Arizona State University in 2013, where she focused on the archaeology of climate-driven risk and vulnerability to food security in the US Southwest and North Atlantic. Her expertise includes convergent research approaches spanning the natural and social sciences and developing cyber infrastructure approaches for the social sciences and indigenous knowledge. She spent the first part of her career working on the interplay between humans and the environment in the U.S. Southwest, which involved 2 stints as an intern at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. So now it's my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Grant and Colleen.
Thank you so much, Susan, and I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Okay, let me stop sharing mine.
Right.
Okay, go ahead, Colleen.
On it. And can you all see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Yep. Thanks, Taylor. So welcome, everyone. It's so nice to be talking about Southwestern archaeology again. It's really exciting to be back to talk to the Crow Canyon community. And as Susan just explained, we'll be talking about a recent paper that we just had come out in American Antiquity that really explores the interplay between climate and people in the ancient U.S. Southwest. And while Grant and I will be leading this presentation, this was a massive, massive team effort by all of our co-authors seen below. So I'm just going to read their names: Matt Peoples, Keith Kintig, Ann Kinzig, Kyle Bozinski, Brad Butterfield, Jacob Freeman, Sarah Oss, Peggy Nelson, John Sandor, and Kate Spielman. And all of us, I would just say that Grant and I just kind of describe ourselves as the synthesizers of this group. We were in this research, we were really building off decades of experience and work, and quite frankly, the genius of all of our co-authors. And so we are really looking forward to the Q&A session, but for some of the nitty-gritty details of the Zuni area or the Salinas area, I might have to point you to our co-authors, but that this effort was very much a team effort that took place pretty embarrassingly on my part over a decade. But we're really excited to be here and to talk more about it. So I just wanted to Grant and I wanted to quickly introduce ourselves a little bit more because, well, I've been out of the U.S. Southwest archaeology game for a couple of years now that I'm working in the Arctic, and Grant this is his first foray into the U.S. Southwest. And so I just kind of wanted to show some photos that we actually have worked in the Southwest before and that I miss it dearly. So you can see here in the bottom right, I love this photo because it's me working hard in the unit with a bunch of people staring at me doing manual labor. And then here, me in the middle is working in Iceland, which is where a lot of my work now. But the top left photo is one of my favorites. You can see Aaron Baxter, Susan, and I in a helicopter way back in, gosh, I think 2002 or 2003, before we were all PhDs. So that's one of my favorite photos to look back on. So I just wanted to introduce myself briefly, and I'll hand it over to Grant now to introduce himself.
All right, thanks, Colleen. Yeah, like Colleen said, going to ASU, you get a certain exposure to Southwest archaeology just through classes, coursework, working with great professors who have these really great careers working in the Southwest. So I've had my fair share of exposure, but really haven't done a lot of the in-depth work in the Southwest that a lot of my colleagues have. But what I have done is sort of pursued a different path, focusing more on environmental reconstruction, particularly focused on fire, anthropogenic fire, and how we both collect data associated with understanding that process and then how we model it too. So my background is primarily in putting these big soil cores down into the ground, extracting them, and then learning all that we can about what was going on in terms of vegetation change and fire regimes and how people may have influenced those in the past. My field work, my dissertation work was primarily in Spain, but I was able to work with the Forest Service quite a lot in Arizona, in Oregon, and in Washington, and now with colleagues here in the Southeast, doing a lot of archaeological survey, excavation, but then primarily working again on sort of that fire aspect of things, which also has, allowed me to work as a wildland firefighter every once in a while. Also, consulting on some of these archaeological resources that are threatened by wildfires, which, as we all know, are increasingly more and more common in our world today. So that's a bit of my background. But I also will say I do a lot of GIS, a lot of modeling, which will, as you see, play very heavily into a lot of the work that Colleen and I are going to be talking about as we go forward.
Yes,
So,
Grant, sorry, go ahead, Grant. I didn't mean to cut you off.
oh, I was just going to toss it back to you.
Okay, thanks. Well, I would just say that Grant's expertise in R and coding and modeling was really critical to bringing this research to, well, this publication at least, to the finish line. So you'll hear more about that in a couple of slides. So I wanted to contextualize the small part of research that we'll be presenting today as a part of a larger project funded by the Coupled Natural Human Systems program at the National Science Foundation. And this project was called the Long-Term Vulnerability and Transformation Project. And this slide does not do it justice at all. We could probably hold another 5 or 6 webinars on this project and the other outcomes of it. But I just wanted to put it out there that it really was this transdisciplinary team of archaeologists, ecologists, and computer scientists exploring the intersections between resilience and social transformations in the archaeological record. We primarily focused in the U.S. Southwest and northern Mexico. I'll show you a map in a second. And then we also bled into the North Atlantic, which is where my foray into the Arctic came from. So you can see our team in the bottom right corner. That was one of our last meetings, actually, putting together some of our final kind of analyses and things like that. But really, the key member was Peggy Nelson, who you could see in the bottom left-hand corner talking to some of our colleagues. She was just so excellent, herding us kittens and trying to help us speak the same language, which is so critical in doing interdisciplinary and synthesis research, like the kinds that we'll be presenting today. So without Peggy's leadership, this project and this research just would not have been possible. And so, as I just alluded to, the larger LTVTP, that's the acronym of the Long-Term Vulnerability and Transformation Project, did really focus on the wider U.S. Southwest and going into northern Mexico. But today, in this analysis, we had to kind of bound it. It's a big research project that we were talking about. So we were really focusing on the Cibola and the Salinas regions. Many of you are probably familiar with them, but you can see them on the map there. And what was really quite critical at the start of this research was for all of us, given that we were all coming from different backgrounds. We had undergraduate students with us. I was a graduate student. I was a graduate student in this photo, actually. And we had ecologists and computer scientists. And what was really critical for us was to go out on the land and just talk about the archaeology, the environment, and just converse together about what we could actually say about these really big topics. When we talk about climate change and the environment and the archaeological record, it's really hard to wrap your head around. So these trips were really critical for us to, again, speak the same language and really make sure that we were doing justice to the data that we were going to analyze. So here you see Kate Spielman telling us quite a bit about her experience and her research in the Salinas region. Here's a photo of myself taking a photo. These photos, by the way, are from Brenda Shears, who is an amazing photographer and was willing to share these photos back in the day. And I just thought I would highlight them because they're so beautiful. But you can see the wider landscape of the Salinas region here, which will become important in a second. And then here's another photo of our team in the Zuni Cibola region. Again, so critical for us to just walk around the landscape. It's actually incredible how important that is to really just understand that these are our data, right? And they're not just numbers in a spreadsheet. And I think that was really critical to make sure that our synthesis was well grounded. And so as I was walking around the landscape, at least, and I have a feeling a lot of my other colleagues were thinking about this. I grew up on the East Coast. I live now on the East Coast again. And, you know, the rainfall patterns are really different on the East Coast than they are in the Southwest, not surprisingly. And I just became absolutely fascinated by scenes like these, which are really common in the US Southwest. Here's another one. This is actually my background photo for my Zoom camera. I became fascinated with scenes like this. And, you know, thinking about farmers, today and in the past, trying to support large populations to make sure everyone had enough food when these scenes were really common, that it could be raining here and your field might be getting rain here, but a field 5 minutes away would not get rain all summer. And so that became really the crux of some of the research that we started to think about, instead of just focusing on one place and climate change in one place. And while that research is incredibly valuable, I think we kind of took a step to zoom out and look at this more at a landscape scale. And again, I just wanted to focus in on the Zuni and Salinas regions here. For those of you kind of listening in, we're using Zuni and Cibola pretty interchangeably here. But again, here are the regions that we're really focusing on in this talk. And what people are doing in the talk, we know in terms of farming that this was mostly rain-fed dry land farming. And so I wanted to show these photos here. The photo on the left is a little bit washed out. I actually think I took this photo on my first field school that was led by Peggy Nelson and Michelle Hegman back in 2002, I think. So that's why the quality is not great. But you can see these little red arrows are pointing at check dams here. And so this is kind of one way that people were concentrating water and soil to different farm areas. And you can see another example of this on the right as well. So for the purpose of our research, we really focused on these rain-fed fields that were absolutely dependent on growing season summer precipitation. We know and acknowledge that the agricultural landscape looks much more complicated than that. We know that people were drawing water off of rivers. We will talk a little bit more about some of the complexities of the Salinas agricultural landscape too. But because we are modeling a very complex system, we need to kind of make some boundaries. And so that is what we're focusing on here. And so again, this is like one of my favorite photos, clearly, returning to the scene. If you're thinking about these rain-fed fields, how are people making sure that they can grow enough food every summer to support really large populations through time? We know people were living in these areas, and we know large populations were living in these areas for centuries and millennia. So they were clearly doing it successfully. So we wanted to dig into this a little deeper. So we also know that there are a ton of risk mitigating strategies. We know that people, given the scene that you just saw, this scene here, we know that people had to have strategies to buffer against risks. Should their field not receive rain that year? Should it be really windy one year? Should they get a really cold winter? Should they get an early freeze? Things like that. So we know that there are other risk buffering strategies. So here's the photo on the bottom left. It's actually a photo from Hopi, and you can see these little coffee cans protecting an early corn crop. So that's one way to mitigate risk, are different and innovative agricultural strategies. We know that there are a ton of those in the U.S. Southwest. We know that exchange. So I use the Tulsa Mercantile with a storefront, and you can see, diverse pottery types. These are kind of ways that we can see in the archaeological record of exchange. So if you need to trade pottery for food, or if people need to move around, those exchange and social networks are going to be really critical to draw upon if you have a rough year. And then another critical strategy would have been storage. And I couldn't really find a good picture of storage. So this is actually a picture on the bottom right from Mesa Verde. You can see these kind of corn grinding areas, but storage of corn and other crops and wild resources would have been critical. Should you have a bad year or a bad 2 years, that you can pull into that storage and feed your family and your community. So at a very high level, this is where things get really complicated, right? We really wanted to explore what is the relationship among climate change, precipitation patterns, agriculture, food security, and risk mitigating strategies. So this is a big question, and which is why we need to set some boundaries, right, to make sure that we can better understand different aspects of this in the archaeological record. So to kind of drill down into some of our more specific questions, we were asking, really, was there a relationship between climate-driven changes to patterns of precipitation and social transformations? And we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by that, and Grant will get more into that with his methodology. And really what we're thinking about, again, we are focusing on those rain-fed fields that are dependent on growing season precipitation. The major risk to food security of northern U.S. Southwest communities would not have been enough summer rainfall to feed crops. If they did not get enough summer rainfall, then they would have had to draw upon other types of networks or some of those risk mitigating strategies to make sure that they could feed themselves. So moving on to that, if they did have to rely on these other risk mitigating strategies, were climate conditions favorable, or were they not, to rely on these strategies at a given time and place on the landscape? And so we know that there are dozens, if not hundreds of strategies to lessen risk to food insecurity. I touched on a couple of them, but we focus on three. Again, boundaries with modeling is really important here. We focus on three of these: reliance on other resources, wild resources. We focus on wild plants, the storage of maize for 3 years, and calling upon social networks to move food, people, if you do not get enough summer rainfall in a given year. So this is where we're trying to drill down to really understand this interplay and the dynamics here. And so the critical question, again, another question that we're trying to figure out with this wider kind of research theme, is what happened when the structure of the climate landscape, and by that we mean, did patterns of where rainfall fell. So you can see in the background of my photo, if those storms if that pattern is changing where those storms are falling, is that driving different risk mitigating strategies? Are risk mitigation strategies that were developed over previous generations being challenged, or were they no longer reliable if climate changed at a given time? So this is really what we're trying to explore in this research. And so with that, I will hand it over to Grant to talk a little bit more about our methods.
Sure. And just so everyone knows, I don't have control of the PowerPoint, so I'm going to be telling Colleen to advance slides as we go here. So sorry if that's distracting. But so thank you, Colleen, for setting the stage for essentially this big methodological contribution that I would love to take credit for. But certainly, again, it's this huge collaborative effort. Many of us sitting in rooms trying to figure out ways that we can measure, or good ways that we can represent these types of relationships that people have with each other and with the landscape, particularly when it comes to mitigating risk. So again, this study is interesting because it seeks to evaluate these relationships between essentially major social transformations on the landscape, these people actually living through these social transformations, and then these risk mitigation strategies that may have been, challenged or stressed due to these changing patterns in the climate at this landscape scale. And so we're specifically, as Colleen said, trying to model and evaluate the spatial structure of climate conditions so we can then understand these risk mitigation strategies, again, drawing on social networks, hunting and gathering of wild resources, and storing surplus food. But we're trying to understand it at sort of a spatial scale. And a temporal scale. So we're coming at it from two dimensions there. And again, the other thing that's actually really interesting, and I think that's really important for this type of work, is that we're not interested in looking at sort of big century level or millennial scales changes on these landscapes. We're really, really interested in how risk can be mitigated at a human level. So again, we're looking to model these changes at specifically this 2 to 3 generational sort of time period. So approximately 60 years across these landscapes. So that's really the scale of our analysis. It's really focused at the human scale and understanding how that plays out across the landscape spatially and then through time. So with that, we can go ahead and move on to the next one, Colleen. So the baseline data that really drives a lot of the analyses that we did for this project come from essentially modern meteorological data that's been compiled from Oregon State University's PRISM Climate Group. So essentially, this is a spatially explicit gridded raster data set. So essentially, we have the entire contiguous United States divided up into 800 by 800 meter resolution cells that each represent either precipitation, so essentially millimeters of precipitation, or temperature, so max or min temperature across the entire United States. And this is really only for essentially from about 1910 until 2000. I think now we've got it all the way up till 2020. But essentially, this is all data that's been derived from meteorological weather stations across the United States and then interpolated using all sorts of algorithms to accommodate for spatial variation along the landscape. But it gives us this really great high resolution data set of precipitation and temperature meteorological data that we can then use to understand changing risk in the past. But again, you might have noticed that I said that they go back to 1910, 1890, somewhere in there. which is certainly not the time range of our interest. We're interested in about 1,000 years before that. So in order to take these modern data and make them meaningful for a lot of the analyses that we need to do during our time periods of interest, we actually relied on a climate retrodiction procedure that was actually developed by Kyle Pakinski, called the paleoclimate reconstruction from tree rings using correlation-adjusted correlation. PaleoCar is what he calls it. And so this is a great package in R that essentially allows us to use tree ring data from the Southwest to calibrate these modern data and reproject them back into the past to help us understand changes both temporally and spatially in precipitation and temperature, which we can then, and again, these are estimates, but then we can use those to understand essentially how meteorological data changed in our study areas across the time period that we're interested in. So we're able to do these paleo environmental reconstructions from year 1 to year 2000, and then basically our period of 900 to 1540 was right there in the middle, and this provided us a great spatially gridded data set that we could use for our analysis. So from there, so that's the data set. So Colleen, if you want to go ahead and advance this. So from there, we're going to start with social networks as sort of the first index that we were interested in calculating and then interpreting as a risk mitigation strategy. So what we're actually calling it anti-correlation. So this basically means that one location on the landscape is experiencing more precipitation, while another place on the landscape is experiencing less precipitation at the same time, or vice versa, essentially aggregated over the entire year. So basically, we're looking for those places that have relationships with other places on the landscape where they're having a really great year and the other place is having a bad year, or they're having a bad year and this other place is having a really great year. So we can look for those spatial locations through time to see if there might be relationships, particularly social relationships between those places that we can track with the archaeological data as a potential avenue for risk mitigation. So because the main driver of food security in the Southwest is rain-fed agriculture, like precipitation is our main input for this particular index. And again, we're relying just on that growing season precipitation, which is what we classified as May through October. So essentially, to calculate this index, what we're doing, essentially, we identify a cell that we call our focal cell. So this, as you can see here in the little schematic, that's the one in orange. So that's essentially one 800 by 800 meter pixel on the landscape that corresponds to where an archaeological site or another culturally important place in the landscape might be. And so from there, we calculate a 61-year running mean. So essentially the focal year and then back 60 years. So that, again, that 2 to 3 generational period. And we calculate this mean in a standard deviation for that particular cell, drilling down through time to see essentially what the past at that particular place looked like. Then we set a threshold of a 0.5 standard deviation above that running mean and below that running mean. And that essentially, those become our bookends where we can help to define whether we have a normal year. So if we fall between those two particular thresholds, if we have a good year, so a particular precipitation year goes above that 0.5 standard deviation, or if we have a really bad year, so if we dip down below it. So essentially, for that cell, every single year within our focal time period, we calculate those bookends, and then we classify that year as whether it's a good, normal, or a bad year. We do this for our entire time period of interest, so 900 to 1540. And then we look at the rest of the landscape. So Colleen, if you want to go ahead and go to the next one. We look at the rest of the landscape going cell by cell, and we look for cells that, again, we calculate the same thresholds for their individual particular standard deviations that are correlated to that particular running mean of precipitation for that cell, and we classify them as good or bad years. And then what we do is we find the times when our focal cell is having a good year, we find all the places on the landscape that are having a bad year, that essentially that focal cell could help. So they would be anti-correlated in a good way, in a way that could help them. And we also look for then, when that focal cell is having a bad year, we look for all the places on the landscape that are having a good year that then could help that particular focal cell. And so that's how we're essentially classifying this relationship, both spatially and then through time, in order to sort of map onto the landscape places that could help or could be helped by our particular focal cells. And again, we could run this for every single cell. We could basically have every single cell in our entire study area be a focal cell, but we didn't have the computing power at the time, and I couldn't code fast enough to do that. So what we're doing is we're just focused primarily on places that we know that had archaeological sites that we could then correlate together. So the next one, please, Colleen. So in practice, this is sort of what it looks like. So this is an example from Salinas. So if you look up here on the scale, it might be a little tough to see, but essentially we coded all the cells on the landscape using this bicolor sort of scale. So essentially, if over a time period, essentially we tallied up all the times that focal cells could help, or all the other cells could help the focal cell, or all the other cells couldn't help the focal cell. There we go. Essentially, we tallied up all those good and bad relationships when a cell could help other cells and when other cells could help it. And so, essentially, if you look at the red here, some places on the landscape that could be helped by the focal cell, so focal cell can help others, those are coded more red. And places where the other cells could help the focal cell, those are coded more blue. And since we're tallying these all up, we actually have a combination of both of those relationships happening at once. And so that's why we kind of get the less sort of less red and less blue, and then kind of this gray in between if they have sort of an equal relationship. And so what's great about this is it not only helps us to evaluate spatially where we have these helping relationships, but then we also can look at it through time, but then we can also look at the strength of those relationships across these different time periods. So Colleen, I think you were going to tackle sort of the Salinas case study as sort of an example of this in terms of social networks.
Yes, thanks, Grant. So you did a great job explaining a very complex methodology that took us a while to figure out how to explain to. So we know there'll probably be a bunch of questions, but we'll get to them, we promise. But the thing that was really great about the initial Salinas analysis is that we published it initially in a book chapter in a book that was led by Kate Spielman, actually, on the Salinas region. And what you see in these maps actually is that, so you see the focal sites here, Abo, Gran Quivira, and Robinson. And you can see that actually, so Robinson is down here. And you can see actually there's quite a bit of at least climate opportunity for exchange. And that's increasing through time. And so these are actually the later time periods. We only have like 45 minutes tonight. Unfortunately, we could show you, Grant has been through the ringer making like hundreds, if not thousands, of visualizations and maps that we have stared out over time. And we're happy to share those too. But what we're seeing here is an increase in what is essentially a climate opportunity of anti-correlated patterns. So it seems like a lot of these sites may be in a position to help each other should they have a bad year. And interestingly enough, from the work that has been done by Kate and her colleagues, we're seeing these increasing anti-correlated rainfall patterns actually corresponding with an increasing trade of pottery. So we're actually seeing potentially a relationship between increasing exchange and these increasing opportunities on the climate's precipitation landscape to take advantage of those networks. So the mutual reliance for food assistance between these places like Poray and Abo and places like Gran Quivira and Pueblo Blanco after the mid-1300s would have been reinforced by exchange of plainware vessels from villages on the eastern side of the Manzanos Mountains, for example, Poray. We see this in the archaeological record, and then later glazeware ceramics from Abo to the Humanos Pueblos, which grew substantially in the mid-1400s. So this is getting into the nitty-gritty of the archaeological record. I would, if you want to learn more, the book chapter is a great resource. But the other part that this book chapter actually focuses on is, again, we know the risk landscape. The agricultural landscape is much more complicated than just rain falling onto a field, right? So another part of this chapter really addressed some of our collaborators actually walked around the Salinas landscape and identified these landscape modifications on the landscape in which people were actually taking advantage of these basins, which were kind of elevating water tables and perched water tables. We have a bunch of evidence that essentially we saw people in the past modifying their landscape to concentrate rainfall in some way. So I just wanted to highlight this really quickly because this will be a critical aspect when we get to the end of our Cibola results as well. And then, so just wanted to touch briefly. So the Salinas case study actually only touched on, it was a preliminary analysis published a couple of years before the American Antiquity article. And we really just focused on the anti-correlation patterns and those landscape modifications. And so we wanted to touch on the Zuni landscape as well. So you can see here again, I'm going to do my Zoom thing and disappear all the speakers. So you can see here compared to, I'll go back quickly to the Salinas map so you can see them actually. And just keep these in mind so you can see the actual saturation of the colors on how strong they are. And you can compare these to the Zuni maps. Not a lot of saturation going on. You have it a little bit more in the later time periods, but really it doesn't really seem like there's this actual climate opportunity in some way to take advantage of, if something is going really well at in Haiku, what is going on at Pueblos de los Muertos. There's not really any anti-correlation. When times are good at Haiku, they're going to be good at Pueblo de los Muertos and vice versa. So this is a really interesting difference from the Salinas area. Just a quick table here, just to kind of anchor us in the archaeological data through time. With this, the Cibola region, we can see through time, and this is our time period of focus. We're focusing on 900 AD through 1540 AD. And you can see through time, we have widely dispersed ruin blocks and then some aggregation, further aggregation into nucleated towns. And then finally, in the later time periods, we have movement downstream of much of the Cibola population. Lots of other changes in material culture. You can see again that this is a synthesis effort. I am glossing over a lot of rich archaeological data, but this is what we're building upon. And then eventually into these long-lived towns along the Zuni River. And again, we kind of focus on some of the nitty-gritty details here, but really the main conclusion to see from those maps is that there's actually little anti-correlation opportunities from the climate being provided that social networks can really be relied upon in times of need. So that being said, even though the climate landscape doesn't show that, we know from Matt Peoples' research on both his dissertation research and his book that was published is that we know that there's a ton of exchange going on across the Zuni Cibola region. And so not surprisingly, climate is not driving this. And I should also say that is like, we absolutely did not presume that climate is driving these things. It's just, it seems like climate is not the opportunity, or climate change is not the opportunity for people to be trading goods across the landscape because we know things are moving around. So that's a really interesting difference between the Cibola and Salinas regions. And so again, I'll hand it off to Grant to talk a little bit more about our other risk mitigating strategies.
Great, thanks, Colleen. So up next is our wild resources or wild plant index that we used, again, as just another way to evaluate how reliance on wild plants might be particularly important in terms of buffering against agricultural shortfall and in terms of accessing diversity to one's diet. So what we did in this case is that we actually decided to model the spatial distribution and diversity of wild plant resources in our study areas, but using essentially a species distribution modeling approach. And so, I'm not going to really go into all of the sort of methods and assumptions and sort of theory behind species distribution modeling. That's not necessarily my forte. Again, we relied on the expertise of many of our partners and research collaborators, but there are just sort of a couple key concepts I think that are kind of important to understanding how this works. So first off, what we did, again, Colleen showed sort of that large map of our LTVTP study area, which spanned essentially most of the Southwest down into northern Mexico, very large area. And so we're actually interested in pulling, basically coming up with species that we thought would be important for, the ecozones that sort of span that large area in the Southwest. So what we did is that we came up with a list of essentially historic staple wild plant species from the North American Ethnobotany database. And also, drawing on archaeological knowledge of wild plant use, we essentially came up with a list of about 100 species that were important for subsistence communities here in the broader Southwest. And so essentially from there, we used maximum entropy models in R, so maxint, to essentially look at presence and absence of those particular species across each one of our study areas, and then used mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation, which oftentimes you plug in lots of variables to these species distribution models. These actually came out as being the most robust in helping us to predict the distribution of these species. So basically kind of a sort of a cost calculation there. We could put more variables in, but we decided to stick with the ones that were the best predictors. So, but essentially by using the location of where we know these species are present or absent, tying those into the mean annual temp and precipitation, using a maximum entropy approach, we were able to come up with probabilities of presence and absence, essentially species distribution across each one of our study areas. From there, we decided to basically cut a threshold and say either present or absent, combine those together for each one of our time periods, and then produce essentially a final species richness map that corresponded to essentially each study area. But we decided instead of sticking to those transformation periods that Colleen was identifying in that previous table, we decided to do 50-year slices, so we could really see the change in distribution of and diversity of species at sort of a finer resolution, one that's again kind of tied more into that 2 to 3 generational period that we're interested in. So next slide, please, Colleen. So here's an example of one of the results for our Zuni Cibola case. So you can see you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, we have our species richness, spanning from 0 species, again, these being the culturally important wild plant species, all the way up to 20. You can see that elevation certainly seems to play a very important role in the distribution of wild plants that were important to people in this area, with our highest diversity being in sort of the mountainous regions that sort of broadly border the Zuni Cibola case study there, and then less diversity in some of the more low-lying areas. But yeah, so that's just sort of a close-up look. And then our next one here, you can actually see what this looks like through time. So we can really see that we have that potentially the same spatial pattern of wild plant diversity and essentially species richness across each one of our time periods. Again, these are 50-year slices. We do kind of skip a couple just because we have if you divide 600 years into 50-year slices, you get a lot of maps. So these are just sort of soundings across that time period as a whole. But you can see there's not a lot of change in the diversity or distribution of these particular wild plant species. We do have some extension or receding of diversity, particularly if you look sort of at the bottom maps from about 1300 or 1350 to 1399, and then 1500 to 1549. We do see some change there, but overall, we're seeing some pretty consistent patterns of species richness across the landscape. But if you go to the next slide, Colleen, we look at the table, and actually what we see is actually an interesting thing. So we do have pretty stable plant diversity across the landscape, but we have changing settlement patterns that actually make it more difficult to access those wild resources. So again, we're kind of moving through from 900 to 1540. We have some periods of some change in the wild plant diversity, but really what happens is toward the end of our period, 1401 to 1540, we have still some good diversity particularly up in those upland areas. But what we have is aggregation of these villages into these long-lived towns that actually are located in places on the landscape that are along some of these riverine environments that are actually kind of farther away from the higher elevation species-rich areas that may have been more easily accessible or more reliable at different times in the past. So that's why that one was coded by our case study experts as being sort of the worst time period for reliance on wild plant species as a risk aversion or risk management strategy. So next slide, Colleen. This is our last index that we're talking about today. So this is a storage shortfall index. And essentially, so from the ethnographic literature, we know that storage failure at a location, it can be essentially storage is a way that people mitigate against risk, but storage failure can actually be pretty closely related to essentially the frequency of growing season precipitation shortfalls that occur sequentially. So what we decided to do for our study here was to kind of define what that means. So we said that for our particular index, we would look at, again, the previous 60 years plus the focal year. So that essentially 61-year antecedent precipitation, derive a running mean from that, again, bound it with our upper and lower standard deviation, this time only really focused on the lower standard 0.5 standard deviation. And essentially, we classified a storage shortfall year as a year when our precipitation dipped below that 0.5 standard deviation of that running mean. So when that happened, again, we're looking at one single cell, and for 1 year, we look and see, is that 1 year below the running mean for the previous 60 years? And if it is, if it's below the mean and if it's below that 0.5 standard deviation, it's a bad year. It's a storage shortfall year. But if that happens again the next year, and then again the next year after that, if we have 3 consecutive years in a row where that happens, we call that a storage shortfall event. And so that's essentially, we tally those events to look at when we have these sequential periods of really prolonged storage shortfall where we fall below that 0.5 standard deviation of our running mean. So that's how we calculated that. But to sort of see it in practice, if you want to go to the next slide, Colleen. So this is an example from Haiwaku. This is essentially looking at our precipitation across, again, from 900 to 1540. You can see the variation in precipitation through time. You can see this is not a running mean, but essentially this is it's just a mean with a standard deviation, so you can sort of see the distribution there. But highlighted in red here, we have some periods where we consistently dip really low in our precipitation. And so those are being categorized as, again, they're meeting that criteria where they have 3 years in a row where they're below that 0.5 standard deviation. Whereas if you look at this area that's highlighted with the blue rectangle, we do have some major dips in our precipitation that's occurring at that time, but they rebound very quickly. So you have one really bad year, but then the next year you're back up to either normal or above normal precipitation conditions. And so those were not classified as being storage shortfall events because we didn't have the sequential 3 years in a row that really made it, a really taxing and stress and risk-inducing event. So if you want to go to the next slide. So again, this was spatial exploration in the structure of storage shortfall on the landscape. So again, we're looking at doing this for each individual cell and then evaluating that particular cell's precipitation history and how storage plays into that. So here's an example of our study area again. And so we're moving here, in this case, from blue to red. Blue meaning that you had no years during this time period that actually experienced one of those shortfall events. And then the red, we're moving all the way up to half of the years in this 1401 to 1540 experienced half of those years experienced a storage shortfall event. So that's how we interpret those. So moving on, we can then see the entire study area. You can see again the temporal change in the structure of both the temporal and the spatial change in the sort of structure of risk on this landscape, moving again from the 900s all the way through time up to the 1540s. And then we kind of summarize those again, those results again in our table here, again looking at each time period for the Zuni Cibola case study. And so we can see here again a changing picture of storage stress. And again, like most of our indices, the most stress occurred in the last transformation when communities were aggregated into these large villages and towns, particularly between 1401 to 1540. But then, as we also learned from the archaeology of this region, it's also a time when, again, settlement moved to these valley bottoms when, riverine irrigation replaced a lot of the rain-fed irrigation systems, meaning that perhaps there was less dependence on storage, or it may have been buffered a bit more by, a more temporally, reliable agricultural system using, river-fed irrigation rather than rain-fed irrigation for growing your crops. So with that, I think I'm passing it back to Colleen.
Yeah, so we have a couple of slides to go, so I hope you're hanging with us. So as Grant just alluded to, in these times of stress and some of our risk mitigating factors, especially the potential for the use of wild resources and storage stress, we have people in the Cibola region moving to the Zuni River, and that's where the majority of the population is living. So really understanding that local context is critical to figure out what is really going on in this kind of potential to use those risk mitigating strategies. So let's just step back. We're throwing a lot of information at you right now. So what the overall patterns that we're seeing? So returning to the Salinas case study, remember that we were seeing increasing anti-correlated areas, places that were receiving really good precipitation, and those that were not receiving great amounts of precipitation were corresponding with increasing evidence of exchange between those areas, which is really interesting. We also saw that features on the landscape created perched water tables. There were places to divert water and to concentrate water on the landscape that could have been helpful in times of low summer precipitation as well. Cibola, on the other hand, is pretty different, right? We have no evidence for substantial changes in anti-correlated precipitation patterns through our time period of interest, although we know there's a ton of exchange going on within the region. And we really see a lot of stress, however, to storage and to wild resources, especially in that later time period. So what does this all mean? So what we're seeing that we think is that this potential link between severe storage stress in that later time period, AD 1400 to 1540, when people have moved down to that river, and there's also a major shift in agricultural technology at the time. So they're increasingly focusing on water, riverine agriculture around the Zuni River. So rain-fed farming actually became less important at this time. So it appears that instead of focusing perhaps on exchange networks or they couldn't really rely on storage from our data, perhaps this change in agricultural technology is really critical to have food security during this time of stress. But in the Cibola region, we could see that the Cibola region has access to a river. The Salinas region has no meaningful surface water to rely on when rainfall fell short. Those landscape modifications would have been critical, but they would not have provided nearly enough water for crops than the Zuni River would have. So Salinas communities did not have the option to rely on these riverine water sources like the Cibola region did, which is perhaps why we're seeing this higher reliance on exchange networks that we're seeing in our data, which I think is a really cool difference that we're seeing between these regions. So we have talked a lot to you. I'm sure there is a ton of questions. Hopefully we didn't get too bogged down in the methodology. As I mentioned before, we have all been working on this research for probably close to a decade now. So we've been thinking about this and we've been in the details for a long time, and it's hard to fit all of this into a 45-minute talk. I have to, as an NSF employee, I have to thank the National Science Foundation for the funding that supported this research. And here is a screenshot of the article that just came out into American Antiquity. If you really want to dig into the details of the methodology or our results, and then there are links to our data. We have really rich data sets that might be of use to you. I would highly suggest taking a look at that. So with that, we will stop talking and then maybe we can have a conversation.
All right, Colleen and Grant, thank you so much for your presentation. We had some questions come in while you were presenting, and I'll get right down to it. The first one is, what known or measured variables are used to reconstruct temperature and rainfall back 2,000 years, and can that be done reliably?
Grant, do you want to take that one? We probably need Kyle here too, unfortunately.
I know Kyle couldn't be here with us today, but so So the climate retrodictions, that was actually part of his dissertation research, where he again could really dive deeply into how this works. But from what I understand is that essentially what we're doing is we're taking the precipitation data and we're taking our modern precipitation data, using it kind of as a training set to understand sort of variation in tree ring thickness and essentially the attributes that help us reconstruct precipitation from tree rings. We're using that and then drawing on this vast network of essentially this vast database of tree rings to create a continuous record of tree ring data going back our entire 2,000 years. Again, we're drawing on dendrochronology that's been done across the Southwest for many, many years. Some really, really old trees as well, right? And so, but again, the interesting thing is it's not only drawing from from the Southwest, it's actually drawing from essentially wherever it can, and basically queries and finds the closest tree ring data. So, so there's certainly some error that's introduced in that. There's some, reliability issues, whatnot. But again, I trust Kyle has done his homework on that, and there's a pub out there we can probably put into the chat. I think there are several pubs out there with some of his agricultural niche modeling that use this, and it's well vetted. It's been validated using other paleo climate reconstructions. It seems like it's pretty good. But again, that's I'll sort of pass that question off to Kyle, and maybe someday he'll be able to do his own webinar to talk all about that.
Okay, second question. Since you didn't include winter or spring precipitation data, did you create some kind of correlation to account for, say, a year with good ground moisture and bad summer rain and so on?
Yeah, this is a great question, and this is where, and maybe Grant, I can hand it off to you about the methodology too. This is something that our team really struggled with is what variables do we really want to focus on? We know that we can't model the entire agricultural landscape. We spent years being like, okay, how can we model cold air drainages? How can we model like an early frost? How can we do this, and this? So we focused really on growing season precipitation. That was the number one correlated factor to a successful agricultural crop in the northern Southwest. And there are lots of pubs that kind of back up that correlation. I would love to further complicate this model in some way and add more variables. Grant is probably going to go insane if I say, let's add, spring precipitation and soil moisture. John Sandor, who was on our team too, brought up a lot of these complexities too. He's been thinking about agriculture, pre-Hispanic agriculture in the U.S. Southwest. So this is something that, we have to draw boundaries on what we're going to model. We can't recreate the entire world. And so that's something that we just did not focus on in this analysis, but certainly something that could be added to future analyses. Grant, did you want to add anything from the methodological?
Not necessarily. I think that's exactly it. We essentially, as a team, decided this is the most important thing to model right now, but certainly there's room for improving and thinking more about. Soil moisture dynamics are so important in terms of winter recharge and all sorts of stuff. So certainly room to improve, but we had to pick something, so that's what we did. But so far the results have been pretty robust, and so it gives us a way forward, which I think is good to explore those other avenues.
Okay, the next one says, you haven't talked much about temperature in your climate modeling. Cooling and shortening growing seasons would tend to drive people to lower elevations. In central Utah, we have Fremont sites at 6,000 feet with corn, where even today corn is difficult to grow. Any thoughts about the larger pattern of the Little Ice Age?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So again, as Grant kind of mentioned when we were talking about the methodology, is that we really looked at this on the kind of generational time scale. We really took it very seriously that people were creating strategies on that were developed based on the observations of what they and their parents and their grandparents had seen through time. So the Little Ice Age is a really interesting different factor, right? It's operating at a larger scale, a larger time period. So we didn't really look into that. We know it exists. We know that it's there, but we were operating at a really different temporal scale. And again, this is where things get really complicated, right? We know people are moving around the landscape. We know there's a ton of things we can't see in the archaeological record, but that could be an interesting question to look at next. But I really do think we were looking at a different time scale as compared to these kind of bigger climate patterns that we're seeing through time.
Okay, next question. How were the culturally relevant plant species for the species richness measured selection? Let me say that again. How are the culturally relevant plant species for the species richness measures selected?
Yeah, so that's where our expertise comes in. So you actually all heard from Sarah O's a couple of weeks ago on her dissertation research, and we relied on her. And so, and Grant, do you want to explain further what Sarah did?
Well,
we're like, well, don't want to speak on behalf of Sarah, but
from what I know, again, Sarah and I were both graduate research assistants on this project. She was kind of working on that end, I was working on this end. But from what I understand, she used her expertise to identify essentially species that had a broad range of species that we knew would have representation across our entire study area, right? And so it wasn't just something that was directly, tied to the Sonoran Desert, or it wasn't something that was just tied to sort of these northern areas of the, Zuni Cibola region. We tried to get a broad collection of species. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, certainly. I think 100 it was a clean number.
It was the easy way for us. But yeah, so Sarah used her expertise, what we're seeing in the archaeological record, what we're seeing in the ethnographic record, and really just compiled this really excellent list of what would have been the most culturally and economically important species. And that's, again, as a modeling practice, we had to bound it somewhere, or it just would have spiraled quickly out of control. So.
Right, and again, the important thing is that it's an index, and so it's helping us to gauge difference, right? And so, the difference between having 20 species and 0 species located on a landscape at a particular place, that's an important thing. But for us, it didn't really necessarily matter what the species were, but that is a good question, and something that was one of the many directions that this research was going. That we have all these spurs that sort of developed in conversations with the larger LTPTP group that has been wrapped into other research projects and other publications and whatnot.
Yeah, and I should also add too, clearly because this is a synthesis project and we're drawing on a lot of data, all of our data that we're drawing upon is located on TDAR, the Digital Archaeological Records. So I actually think that Sarah's list might be on there. I'm not sure, but we can track it down. But all of the archaeological data that we're drawing on, we took our data management process really seriously, so we could be really transparent about the data that we were dealing with, given that we had to gloss over the really rich archaeological data, and you essentially had to trust us that we were representing it correctly, right? That's what happens with these big synthesis projects. So making the data transparent was really important to us. So that's available there if you want to dig into that too.
And as sort of a follow-up to that, data is one thing, but having sort of the analysis and the code to actually reproduce and replicate what we've done is also, the other side of the coin. And so all of our code that was done in R to essentially create everything that you've seen today, that's also available, again, through TDAR and then linking to my GitHub. You can go and read my really poorly written graduate school code. It's great.
Okay, next question. How does your material research reflect the history and knowledge of the Zuni?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I would so this is where, we thought very deeply about the ethnographic record. I know Keith and Matt, those were our Cibola Zuni experts. Many of you know Keith Kintig and Matt Peoples. I know they take that very seriously. Again, we're aggregating a lot of data, and a lot of that is just tied into both kind of combining indigenous knowledge, indigenous interpretations of the archaeological record, what we're seeing on the ground. So I know our team kind of takes that really seriously, but it's really wrapped into the underlying data that we're building upon.
Okay, this next one is for Grant, and it's related to your fire work.
Oh, nice.
In the El Morro Valley near Pueblo de los Muertos, at about 1275 to 1276, we have evidence for a number of small burned pueblitos, all about the same time. One P1 PI interprets this evidence as warfare. Corn from these pueblitos suggests that the fires occurred about harvest time, with stored corn on the floor and more recently harvested corn on the roofs. How can we be sure this isn't a natural fire? Harvest time is unusual for wildfires in the Southwest, but not impossible.
That's a good question. So, I mean, that's sort of in the anthropogenic fire world of research, detecting between human caused and natural caused fire is sort of the big thing. Like, how do we understand what is a natural change in a fire regime versus a human caused one? And then in this case, even a very specific, like a very specific fire. How do we know what caused it? So it's a difficult question to answer, primarily because the resolution of a lot of the work that I do and a lot of other sort of paleo-fire scientists work at is, it's usually looking at soil cores, looking at lake cores, maybe even alluvial sediments to get at sort of broad trends in fire and how people have influenced those. So detecting sort of the cause or, the extent or what have you of one particular fire is relatively difficult unless you're relying on something like dendrochronology or some other tree scarring data that can give you sort of the spatial extent and timing of one particular fire. So that could potentially be one avenue to explore. There is looking at the dendrochronology from the area, but again, you might not. Certainly, it'd be tough because you don't have standing trees still that probably date back to that time period. But it is a difficult question. But you could look at certain you can look at indicators of sort of the intensity or the essentially the intensity of the fire, looking at essentially how fire affected those structures, charcoal production related to is this a big fire that we're seeing evidence for in a lot of places, or is it just spatially confined there based on sort of the distribution of charcoal across the landscape, things like that. But again, it is hard to sort of get at one particular fire event using a lot of the tools that we have, but it would be really interesting if you could, look at various lines of evidence to try to pinpoint what might have happened here. And again, it also could have been a human-caused fire warfare that could have caused a wildfire. So they're like compounding issues there in interpretation. But it's a good question and an interesting one to think about, particularly, at least for me, when you think about how fire has affected people both present and in the past. I mean, people have been dealing with fire for a very, very, very long time. And it's interesting to think about it at that scale. So.
Okay, let's do one last question before we wrap this up. What's the take-home message for humans today? What can we do differently based on your results?
Colleen.
Thanks, Grant. Well, so this is where things get complicated, right? So we know modern climate change is happening at a pace that people during the times that we're talking about never saw. It's going to be extremely hard for us, and it is extremely hard. I need to stop talking in the future because we know it's occurring now. It's a different pace and it's a different scale what we're dealing with now. That being said, I think some of the research that we're showing here, I find really compelling because we know that people are really creative and really smart, and they come up with ways to deal with these changes, just like we do, and we have, and we are doing right now. And so that's what I find really compelling about this research. It's not just climate change bad, people disappear or they fail. It's that they had a number of strategies to deal with this, and sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't, but diversifying those strategies was really quite critical. So I tend to, I deal a lot. I mean, I work in the Arctic now, and the climate is warming. exponentially faster there than it is anywhere else in the world. So this is kind of my daily life right now, and I think about it a lot. And so I would like to think, trying to stay positive, and thinking about how innovative people are. That's what my Indigenous colleagues up in the Arctic say all the time is, we've dealt with change before. We'll survive this again. It will be difficult, but we're used to this. And that's kind of what the take-home message I take from this research and my research in the Arctic as well.
And just to add one little quick note to that too, I think this kind of work also highlights that we often think of climate change or other environmental change, wildfire, anything like that as like a pressing environmental issue. But really, to me, this really brings it home that it's really a social one as well, right? And so it's how we understand our relationship to our neighbors, how we understand our relationship to the people in our community, and how, again, we rely on those relationships in order to be resilient, in order to, weather changes, just like you were saying with your Indigenous colleagues in the Arctic, Colleen. Like, people make it through these things, but it's by relying on each other. So it's an interesting, it's a good way to couch that and put it in that perspective.
All right. Well, Colleen and Grant, thank you so much for sharing your research with us tonight. And it's time to wrap things up for the evening. Colleen, Grant, and I want to thank all of you that dialed in tonight to watch this webinar. We appreciate you joining us and spending time with us. And as I mentioned earlier in the program, we hope that you, your families, and your communities are staying safe and healthy. We at Crow Canyon are thinking about all of you, and we'll see you on the next webinar. So everybody have a great evening, and we'll see you down the road.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone.
Thanks.